Jeffrey Dahmer's name has become synonymous with terror, mystery, and the darkest recesses of human behavior. His crimes, committed between 1978 and 1991, shocked the world and continue to haunt the imagination of millions today. He wasn't the typical shadowy figure one might imagine lurking in alleyways. Instead, he blended into society, often described as polite, quiet, and unassuming. But behind that facade lived a predator whose obsessions drove him to act so grotesque that they defy comprehension. At the height of his crimes, Dahmer was luring young men into his modest Milwaukee apartment, a place that would later be discovered as a chamber of horrors. Neighbors remembered strange smells, unusual noises, and yet no one could have imagined the extent of what lay inside. His story is not just about murder. It's about power, control, loneliness, and the failure of authorities and communities to stop a man who left devastation in his wake. The fascination with his case persists because it forces us to confront the darkest aspects of humanity and the disturbing reality that evil can wear the face of someone who seems entirely ordinary. To understand Jeffrey Dahmer's crimes, one must look back at his childhood and formative years. Born in 1960 in Bath, Ohio, he grew up in a household marked by instability and conflict. His parents' tumultuous marriage filled the home with tension, while Jeffrey himself became increasingly withdrawn and isolated. Even as a young boy, his fascination with death began to surface. He collected roadkill, dissected animals, and showed an unnerving interest in the inner workings of living creatures. Teachers described him as quiet and disengaged, a child who often went unnoticed. Yet underneath his silence was a storm brewing. His teenage years brought heavy drinking and increasing social isolation, deepening his struggles. While some peers recalled him jokingly acting out strange behaviors for attention, others noticed something unsettling in his gaze. It was during these years that his fantasies about control, dominance, and death began to take root. Combined with a lack of emotional guidance and unresolved inner turmoil, these dark curiosities set the stage for what would later spiral into one of the most horrifying series of murders in American history. Metcalf Fusillo could die at any. As Jeffrey entered adolescence, his struggles intensified. Alcohol quickly became his crutch, a way to numb emotions he didn't fully understand. By high school, he was known for drinking during classes, often sneaking liquor into soda bottles. Beneath the surface, his mind churned with fantasies that disturbed even him. He imagined controlling others completely, keeping them from ever leaving, and even experimented in thought with ways of making people submissive. His family life offered little stability. His parents' marriage crumbled, leaving Jeffrey further adrift. Friends who once saw him as a class clown began to distance themselves as his odd behavior grew more erratic. After graduation in 1978, Dahmer was left largely on his own, isolated in the family home after his mother moved away and his father remarried. It was during this time of solitude that his darkest urges began to manifest with terrifying reality. No longer bound by the supervision of family or peers, Dahmer's fantasies transformed into actions, leading to his first crime, an impulsive act that would set a precedent for years of violence and secrecy to come. In the summer of 1978, just weeks after his high school graduation, Jeffrey Dahmer committed his first murder. He picked up a hitchhiker named Stephen Hicks, offering him alcohol and companionship. Dahmer invited Hicks back to his home, where they spent hours drinking and talking. But when Hicks expressed a desire to leave, something in Dahmer snapped. Terrified of abandonment and desperate to maintain control, he struck Hicks with a dumbbell and strangled him to death. The act wasn't premeditated in the sense of a detailed plan, but it revealed the violent potential lurking beneath Dahmer's calm exterior. Panic quickly set in, and Dahmer dismembered Hicks' body, crushing bones and scattering remains in the woods around his home. Remarkably, he managed to conceal the crime entirely from those around him. This first murder haunted him, but it also awakened something that would later dominate his life. The thrill of exerting total control over another person became an obsession. Though it would be nearly a decade before he killed again, the memory of Hicks lingered as both a shameful secret and a dark temptation waiting to resurface. Following that first murder, Dahmer attempted to suppress his urges by immersing himself in what society expected of him. He enrolled at Ohio State University, though his time there was short-lived. His drinking problem worsened, and he failed most of his classes, eventually dropping out after just one term. Hoping the military might instill discipline, Dahmer enlisted in the U.S. Army in 1979. Initially, he showed promise in training, but his alcoholism sabotaged any chance of a successful career. Stationed in Germany, his behavior grew increasingly erratic, and rumors spread of inappropriate advances toward fellow soldiers. By 1981, he was discharged due to his inability to control his drinking. Returning to the U.S., Dahmer drifted between relatives' homes and odd jobs, struggling to find direction. His father urged him to seek structure, but nothing seemed to anchor Jeffrey. The unresolved darkness within him continued to grow, and while nearly a decade passed before he killed again, his fantasies never disappeared. They lingered in the background, waiting for the right circumstances to emerge and reignite the pattern that had started with Stephen Hicks. After being discharged from the Army, Dahmer attempted to restart his life, moving back in with his grandmother in West Allis, Wisconsin. She was one of the few family members who still showed concern for him, and for a time, her presence provided stability. He attended church with her, held small jobs, and tried to keep his drinking under control. But the facade was thin. His drinking binges returned, and his fascination with dominance and death grew more intense. Dahmer's grandmother complained about strange odors from the basement and his late-night activities, but she overlooked them as odd habits rather than dangerous warning signs. Jeffrey struggled with feelings of inadequacy, loneliness, and desires he could not reconcile. The sense of isolation became suffocating. His attempts to suppress his compulsions only amplified their power. Eventually, these urges overcame his restraint. By the mid-1980s, Dahmer's violent fantasies began pushing him closer to committing murder once again, and this time the killings would not be spaced by years. Instead, they would come in a disturbing succession, escalating in brutality and frequency. It was in 1987 that Dahmer murdered again, marking the beginning of a string of killings that would continue unchecked for years. He met Stephen Twomey at a bar in Milwaukee and lured him to a hotel room. What followed was another unplanned act of violence. Dahmer later claimed he woke up beside Twomey's lifeless body without remembering the murder, suggesting his blackout drinking had collided with his violent impulses. Terrified of discovery, yet compelled to conceal the act, Dahmer purchased a large suitcase, transported the body to his grandmother's house, and dismembered it. Unlike his first murder, this time Dahmer felt an intoxicating mix of horror and satisfaction. The barrier had been broken, and now his fantasy life and reality merged permanently. From this moment forward, his killings became more methodical. He began frequenting bars, clubs, and public spaces, seeking vulnerable young men he could lure with promises of money, alcohol, or companionship. The killings accelerated, each one feeding his desire for control and companionship in a way he felt he couldn't achieve through ordinary human relationships. Dahmer developed a chilling routine that gave him both comfort and confidence in his crimes. He sought victims in gay bars, neighborhoods, and clubs, often targeting men of color who were marginalized and less likely to draw immediate police attention if reported missing. His method was calculated. Offer money to pose for photographs, lure them back to his apartment, drug them, and then carry out the murder. Strangulation became his preferred method, a way to maintain physical control without immediate mess. What made his crimes especially terrifying was not only the killing itself, but what followed. Dahmer engaged in dismemberment, preserving parts of his victims, and sometimes engaging in acts of necrophilia. He took Polaroid photographs of his victims at various stages, creating a personal archive of his horrors. His apartment became both a hunting ground and a laboratory for his obsessions. To outsiders, Dahmer maintained a veneer of normalcy, working at the Ambrosia chocolate factory and greeting neighbors politely. Yet inside his private world, he orchestrated unspeakable acts that blurred the line between murder and ritual. By the late 1980s, Dahmer's need for control had taken on an experimental edge. He began conducting grotesque experiments on his victims in an attempt to create submissive companions. He drilled holes into their skulls and injected acid or boiling water, hoping to induce a zombie-like state. These attempts failed, inevitably leading to death, but they revealed the depth of his obsession with absolute dominance. He wanted companionship without the risk of rejection, someone who would never leave him. These macabre experiments horrified investigators later, but for Dahmer, they represented an evolution in his fantasy life. His victims were no longer simply people, they were raw material for his attempts to engineer the ultimate form of control. His neighbors began noticing strange smells from his apartment, which Dahmer explained as spoiled meat or plumbing problem. In reality, it was the smell of decomposition and chemicals used to dissolve flesh. The duality of his life, polite neighbor on one side, sadistic experimenter on the other, made him an even more chilling figure when the truth finally emerged. While Dahmer grew more reckless, his immediate environment began to betray him. Residents of his building reported constant complaints of foul odors and strange noises. Some claimed they heard power tools at odd hours of the night, while others recalled screams muffled through the walls. When asked, Dahmer offered calm explanations: spoiled food, exotic fish, or plumbing issues. Landlords and neighbors accepted his words, largely because he appeared polite and unthreatening. His outward demeanor provided a shield, but inside his apartment had transformed into a nightmarish workshop of death. Freezers contained severed heads and preserved organs. Acid-filled barrels held dissolving body parts. Photographs of victims in gruesome stages of mutilation were stacked away as trophies. Dahmer maintained this double life with remarkable composure. But the weight of his crimes was mounting. He drank heavily to quiet his conscience, yet the compulsion to kill never relented. The grotesque collection of evidence grew within the small confines of his apartment, symbolizing the depth of his madness and foreshadowing the inevitable moment when his secret world would be exposed to the outside. Cannibalism became a disturbing addition to Dahmer's cycle of violence. He admitted to consuming parts of his victims, including hearts, biceps, and other flesh, not purely for sustenance, but as a way to feel connected to them permanently. In his own words, it made him feel that his victims became part of him. This act pushed his crimes beyond murder and dismemberment, adding a layer of ritualistic obsession that horrified even the most seasoned investigators later. Cannibalism was, for Dahmer, both a symbolic act of control and a desperate attempt to fill the loneliness that plagued him. He kept skulls, bones, and organs as souvenirs, arranging them in his apartment as though creating a shrine. These rituals reinforced his sense of possession over the lives he took. His psyche had reached a point where morality, empathy, and humanity had been stripped away, leaving only hunger for dominance. While he lived outwardly as an unremarkable factory worker, inside his apartment he immersed himself in practices that defied imagination, pushing further into depths of depravity that seemed beyond comprehension. One of the most shocking aspects of Dahmer's killing spree was how often authorities had opportunities to stop him, but failed. In 1991, Dahmer lured 14-year-old Courtroom Synthasimone to his apartment after drugging him. Neighbors soon found the boy wandering the streets, disoriented, bruised, and naked. They called police, begging them to intervene. Yet when officers arrived, Dahmer calmly explained that Courtroom was his adult lover, and the situation was a domestic dispute. Despite the neighbors' protests, police escorted the boy back into Dahmer's apartment, where he was soon murdered. This incident revealed not only Dahmer's manipulative skills, but also deep systemic failures. Homophobia, racial bias, and negligence combined to allow Dahmer to continue killing. For the families of victims, this was one of the most painful revelations. Knowing that lives could have been saved if authorities had looked closer. It was a moment that highlighted how Dahmer's ability to appear harmless shielded him from suspicion, and how societal prejudices blinded the police from protecting a vulnerable victim in plain sight. By 1990 and 1991, Dahmer's killings had reached their most intense and frequent stage. Nearly every few weeks, a new victim was lured into his apartment, often disappearing without a trace. Most were young men of color, members of marginalized communities whose disappearances did not trigger immediate public alarm. The toll on these communities was devastating as families searched in vain for missing loved ones. Dahmer's apartment became increasingly filled with the evidence of his crimes, including multiple skulls, preserved genitals, and bones he intended to use for constructing a private shrine. His need for dominance had escalated to the point where he could not stop himself. Yet, despite the horrifying regularity of his murders, neighbors and acquaintances continued to believe Dahmer was merely odd or reclusive, not a monster in their midst. His ability to function in everyday society while committing such atrocities left investigators stunned when the truth finally surfaced. This phase of his crime cemented his reputation as one of the most prolific and chilling serial killers in modern history. Despite the horrors he committed, Dahmer managed to maintain an outward appearance of normalcy that fooled nearly everyone. He held down a steady job at the Ambrosia chocolate factory, clocking in daily and exchanging pleasantries with co-workers. He often appeared shy but polite, never raising suspicion. Some neighbors described him as friendly, even helpful at times, offering to carry groceries or chat briefly in the hallway. To them, he was an ordinary, if slightly strange, young man. This dual life was part of Dahmer's chilling mastery. He knew how to hide his compulsions behind a mask of normalcy, creating just enough distance between his private horrors and his public persona. In truth, the contrast between his outward life and his inner world only deepened his isolation. Every smile, every polite word was a disguise, covering the gruesome acts he committed nightly. This capacity for deception is one reason his crimes fascinated the world. The idea that someone so ordinary in appearance could harbor such darkness remains one of the most unsettling aspects of his story. The night of July 22, 1991, marked the unraveling of Jeffrey Dahmer's secret world. That evening, he invited Tracy Edwards, a 32-year-old man, back to his apartment with the promise of money and drinks. Inside, Edwards quickly noticed strange things: the foul smell, the unsettling atmosphere, and Dahmer's erratic behavior. When Dahmer attempted to handcuff him, Edwards resisted. Eventually, he managed to escape and flagged down 2 police officers, leading them back to Dahmer's apartment. What they discovered inside would shock the world. Photographs of dismembered bodies, severed heads in the refrigerator, and barrels filled with decomposing remains painted a portrait of unspeakable horror. The police could hardly believe what they were witnessing. The calm, polite man standing before them had created a nightmare behind his apartment door. Dahmer was arrested on the spot. His reign of terror finally brought to an end not by a massive investigation, but by the courage of one man who managed to escape his grasp and alert authorities in time. When investigators thoroughly searched Dahmer's apartment, the extent of his crimes became painfully clear. They discovered human skulls arranged in a shrine-like manner, a freezer stocked with human flesh, and detailed Polaroid photographs documenting every step of his murders. Acid-filled vats and tools for dismemberment transformed the small apartment into a crime scene unlike any the Milwaukee police had ever encountered. The grotesque evidence left no doubt about the scale of Dahmer's atrocities. He calmly confessed to most of the killings, providing chilling details with a detached, almost clinical demeanor. For investigators, it was a surreal experience to listen to him recount acts of unimaginable cruelty without visible remorse. The discovery rocked the city of Milwaukee and soon the entire world. Media outlets swarmed the scene and communities struggled to comprehend how such horrors could have gone unnoticed for so long. The exposure of Dahmer's secret life was more than just the revelation of a serial killer. It was the unmasking of a predator who had exploited society's blind spots to continue killing for years. Jeffrey Dahmer's trial in 1992 was one of the most closely watched in American history. His confessions left little doubt about his guilt, but the central question revolved around his sanity. Defense attorneys argued that no sane person could commit such acts, portraying Dahmer as a deeply disturbed man driven by uncontrollable compulsions. Prosecutors countered that he carefully planned his murders, demonstrating control and awareness of their criminality. Ultimately, the jury found him legally sane and convicted him of 15 counts of murder, sentencing him to 15 consecutive life terms in prison. Families of the victims packed the courtroom, many breaking down in grief as Dahmer's crimes were described in detail. The trial highlighted not only the horror of his actions, but also the pain and devastation left behind. Dahmer himself spoke calmly, expressing regret, but often in ways that seemed detached. Now, the outcome brought some measure of closure to families, but it also deepened the sense of tragedy as they grappled with the knowledge that their loved ones' lives had been ended in such unimaginable ways. Prison life for Dahmer was marked by a strange mixture of notoriety and vulnerability. Other inmates despised him, seeing him as a monster among criminals. He was mocked, threatened, and physically attacked more than once. Reports emerged that he fashioned crude jokes with his food, shaping it into body parts and using ketchup as blood, behavior that disgusted both guards and prisoners. In interviews, Dahmer spoke of finding religion, claiming to have embraced Christianity and undergone a form of redemption. Yet few were convinced of his sincerity. His notoriety made him both infamous and a target. In November 1994, Dahmer's life ended when fellow inmate Christopher Scarver attacked him in the prison gym, beating him to death with a metal bar. For many, his death was seen as a form of justice, though it did not erase the pain he had caused. Dahmer's life in prison reflected the contradictions that defined him: part calculated predator, part broken man, and ultimately a figure who could never escape the consequences of his own action. The legacy of Jeffrey Dahmer remains one of horror, fascination, and lessons about the failures that allowed him to operate for so long. His crimes left deep scars on the families of his victims, who continue to grieve decades later. Communities, particularly communities of color and LGBTQ+ neighborhoods, remain haunted by the knowledge that their warnings and concerns were ignored. The case also highlighted broader systemic issues, including police negligence, societal prejudice, and the difficulty of identifying predators who hide in plain sight. Beyond the pain, Dahmer's story has become a cultural reference point, fueling countless documentaries, books, and discussions about the nature of evil. His actions force society to ask uncomfortable questions. How could someone appear so ordinary, yet commit such atrocity? How can institutions better protect vulnerable populations? And why does the darkness of his story continue to captivate us? Jeffrey Dahmer's crimes serve as both a warning and a grim reminder of the fragility of trust and appearances. His story endures not as a fascination with gore, but as an enduring caution about humanity's hidden shadows. The case of Jeffrey Dahmer continues to echo across time because it embodies the chilling reality that evil can hide in plain sight. He was not a shadowy figure lurking in dark alleys, but a neighbor, a co-worker, and an ordinary man whose monstrous acts unfolded behind closed doors. His story is not just one of death and destruction, but also of the countless failures that enabled him. Neighbors whose concerns were dismissed, police who overlooked warning signs, and a society that stigmatized the vulnerable communities he preyed upon. For true crime historians, psychologists, and criminologists, Dahmer remains a case study in the intersection of loneliness, obsession, and unchecked impulses. For families of his victims, however, his name represents pain that cannot be erased. The fascination with his crime should never overshadow the humanity of those he destroyed. As the years pass, his story persists because it warns us of the dangers of ignoring red flags and underestimating the darkness that can live behind a quiet smile. In the end, Jeffrey Dahmer's legacy is not just about what he did, but about how we must remain vigilant against the monsters who walk among us.